Hello, welcome to session J7, which is spotlighting stormwater management techniques. I'm Lori Rafferty. I am the MS4 and floodplain manager for Louisville, Kentucky. So stormwater and floodplain are both near and dear to my heart. And we have three interesting presentations for you today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box, and feel free to do that as the presentation is going, and we'll answer those at the end. Our first presentation is Healthy Streets for Urban Flooding in Your Neighborhood. The main presenter is Dustin Atchison with Jacobs. He is a Jacobs Global Technology Lead for Stormwater and Watershed Management and has over 22 years of experience with Jacobs and CH2M Hill and water resources and stormwater management. Mr. Atchison is a recognized regional and national leader in green infrastructure with expertise in development of master plans, guidelines, education, and implementation of stormwater solutions that bring multiple benefits to communities. He is a licensed engineer in the state of Washington and a project management professional. Welcome, Mr. Atchison. Oh, I'm sorry. There's actually a co-presenter also. Elise Ivendal. She is also with Jacobs and a PE, a PMP, and a CFM. And welcome.
Hi, my name is Dustin Atchison. I'm the Global Technology Lead for Stormwater and Watershed Management for Jacobs. I am joined today by Elise Ivendal, who is also a Global Technology Lead for Flood Modeling and Planning. Today we are joining forces to present Healthy Streets for Urban Flooding in Your Neighborhood. And to set the stage, I'm going to take you back to pre-pandemic days, way back when we had a streetscape that was dominated by cars. And in the early days of our pandemic, what we found was obviously that this area really concentrated pedestrian spaces too tight to be able to maintain physical distancing for people to go out and enjoy our outdoor spaces. As well, if you look at these pictures, you can also see it's not really that inviting or healthy of a space for our ecosystem as well. You see there's very little space for trees. And that's really the case post-pandemic as well. Our streets are not exactly conducive to healthy systems for our humans and for our ecosystems. And so that's really the premise of this discussion today, is to think about what could our streets be in the future to be healthier for humans and the ecosystem, so we can protect those downstream resources while also supporting our human needs and resources.
Great. Thanks, Dustin. That was just such a nice slide. And again, like Dustin was talking about the time before, for our cities, there was a time before, and it was like that stream that you saw in that previous picture. That's what our cities used to be, are built on top of. We have filled in a lot of those rivers and encroached upon them as well for the ones that remain. And what, when it rains, it doesn't necessarily care or know what is on the receiving end of that. And so that's how you end up with the inundation that you see on the left. Urban flooding, I see it as having three components. There's the utilities, essentially the sewers underneath and how we make it work. Then there's the infrastructure that's impacted, whenever it gets higher, we impact our infrastructure. That top layer is our community, which gets into where we want healthy communities that don't flood, and really it disproportionately impacts communities from a social vulnerability angle as well. So that's something else to think about on these. If we go to the next slide. So urban flooding, so many causes, and it creates so many challenges. The root causes of urban flooding, they vary widely. And they're significant for similarly varying situations. The challenges are unique to every single community or neighborhood, which again gets into that street level that we're talking about when you get into urban flooding. Then another problem is whenever those streams are filled, it doesn't help the funding situation because it's out of sight, out of mind until the rain pops out. The causes and solutions are multidisciplinary. So that's another layer for us to put our thinking caps on with. Rainfall is going to increase. We're going to continue to see cloudburst, high intensity, and more rainfall. So we need to adapt and transform to a new reality. Is our typical 20-year planning horizon still appropriate, or do we need to look forward to what kind of communities do we want in the year 2100? The problems are so many different scopes and sizes, and the mitigation actions are too. So that calls us to get creative, and we need to do things differently. And also that, it goes into stakeholder engagement and how policy engages with it too. It's not just structural solutions. And a lot of that plays into the healthy streets angle as well. It's not necessarily a state or a federal issue. It's what we do at the local as well. So Dustin, back to you. Oh, no, not back to you. So this is a project of mine. As you look and see everything that is green, red, colored, that's all the floodplain. The creek has been encroached upon. It has not been buried, but still you can see we have water where we don't want it within the urban context. This happens, they get flooding on that highway about every year or two. If you go to the next slide, this is the mitigation plan. You see the trails in there. Those trails actually connect to the regional trail system. There's a tunnel that goes under the road. It's not just a flood mitigation project. You know, the main aspect of the flood mitigation project is benching the stream back, restoring the natural floodplain, but bringing with that a lot of amenities for the community. So it's exciting to see what we can do even whenever it's not a sewers or hidden kind of project. It applies to a lot of different ways, the healthy streets concept. Now back to you.
Elise. And well, on that example, we had a great opportunity to be able to reimagine that floodplain and redevelop that area for that community. If we think more holistically about bringing those stormwater controls up into the watershed, we can avoid impacting those underserved communities and providing those sort of issues. So what we're trying to do in that upper watershed is doing the same sort of thing what we talked about at the outset of this conversation, which is we're trying to make that urban environment, that built street environment, act more like a forest and a creek system. It's not going to be exactly the same, but what we're trying to do is really try to bring back some of those functions into those areas so that you can at least reduce how much impact you have on the floodplain downstream in those communities that are often underserved in those areas. So COVID gave us an opportunity to reimagine what the streets could look like, at least for the human environment, for social interactions. Very early in the pandemic, NACTO came out with the guidelines called Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery. And here this shows kind of some schematics of some of these ideas they had for reclaiming some of that streetscape to allow people to socially distance in a healthy manner. So areas such as creating more space for walking paths, creating outdoor markets, outdoor dining, outdoor areas where people can play and do the streets if we close down those streets. Again, these are public spaces, the right of way for the communities and for everybody's needs, not just for vehicles. And so what we're really looking at is how can we leverage those ideas and the learning we're having from the pandemic to understand if we reimagine our streets in the future, how can we also bring in stormwater function along with those other community functions as well. And this has really been a once in a generation pop-up experiment that we've seen, because we've seen some of these measures actually be put into practice during the last year. These are some examples from Exeter, England, where again, some of these ideas are there. Take that curb lane and reclaim it for bike and pedestrian movements. Other solutions, which may be, although not elegant at this point because they're pop-up and they're temporary, you know, such as putting up signage, but really closing streets completely so people can reclaim those streets for walking around and dining, walking your dog out there and being able to maintain distance from each other. What can we do in this space where we can make this permanent? Another example of that curb line, again, another UK example. Here's an example in Seattle, in my hometown here, where they've claimed the parking space in front of this restaurant to do outdoor dining so they can safely dine. We're seeing some of these actually be imagined as like, what can we do after the pandemic to, again, allow people to be able to dine outdoors, to reclaim more space, be more community centered in how we interact in the streets. And what's really cool is we've actually seen some examples of where these two concepts have come together. This is an example, it was pre-pandemic, but it was along this idea of let's join improved mobility projects with green stormwater infrastructure. So this is Seattle Public Utilities. They partnered with the Seattle Department of Transportation, where the Department of Transportation was taking neighborhood streets and redefining them as neighborhood greenways, which is to make them slower enough, so doing traffic calming measures to lower the speeds to less than 20 miles per hour so that families could use the street for biking and walking, as well as now partnering with Seattle Public Utilities to retrofit those streets for green stormwater infrastructure. What was very cool was when the pandemic hit, Seattle Department of Transportation realized we need healthy streets. We need streets that are dedicated for people to be able to use outdoor space. And so they converted many of those neighborhood greenways into what they called healthy streets. And it's been so successful that these are so well received that over 20 miles of these streets in the city of Seattle are going to be made permanent after the pandemic. And again, the premise of this discussion is how do we leverage that now to be able to incorporate stormwater infrastructure? When you think about this, is kind of getting into the how-to portion of the presentation, but we really think about shared space. Don't make it for a single function. How can we take these spaces and make them multifunctional? So we think about like the sidewalk and traditional planter area. Can we do things like tree planting and enhanced tree trenches where we can enter stormwater into that space, or permeable pavements so that we can use it for stormwater. We have medians or turn pockets that aren't used completely. Can we use that leftover space to make rain gardens or bioretention facilities? And similarly, that parking lane where you don't have parking, where you have start and stop spaces there, can you turn those areas into areas that are also traffic calming devices, but also bioretention or other sort of practices? And here's a number of various examples of where green infrastructure is incorporated into the streets. And really, I wanted you to come away with this is it comes in many different shapes, sizes, and types of green infrastructure. It's really having that toolbox of approaches that can really fit into that new multi-use envisioning of the streetscape. So here's a real world example, again, also from the UK, but this is a case where it was a two-way street pre-pandemic. And during the pandemic, in order to create more space for bicycles and pedestrians to use it, they wanted to convert it into a single lane, single direction street, which gave us, again, a lot of space. So when you think about ways you can incorporate green infrastructure into this sort of environment, at the right-hand side of this picture there at the intersection as an entryway into this new environment that's going to have more space for people. So you can do a curb over, curb extension with bioretention there to really choke down the traffic and make people understand you're in a different environment now, and then also be able to manage stormwater there. Other things you can do is take that area that's delineating the space that defines the pedestrian space from the vehicles, and you can use vegetation in that and do things like enhanced tree trenches to be able to claim that space and use it for stormwater. Another example here is again, all these are pre-pandemic, but they're envisioning and giving us a vision into what we can do afterwards. This is Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where we had a very dangerous intersection with a lot of turn movements. What they did was they retrofitted this street to simplify the street, but they also created a lot more space in the right of way. And it created a wonderful opportunity for a partnership with Lancaster Brewing Company to be able to create that space that was created in front of the brewing company as a shared space partnership where we did a permeable pavement patio area for dining along with green infrastructure. What we found there is that in this reconfigured street, we had a much more safe environment. We had a great space for gathering, and we managed a lot of stormwater in this area. In fact, so much extra economic benefit here is people actually will pour out their beers just to test the permeable pavement. So it's actually boosting beer sales as well. But here's the end product, because it's a nice, improved streetscape for humans and for the ecosystem. And again, measured results, 5 mph reduction in average traffic speed through this area with less turning movements. So it's also reduced the number of impacts and collisions. Another example, this is a median project we did in South Lake Union in Seattle. Again, this is the area, the home of Amazon, so it's a very vibrant area, but pre-redevelopment, it was a very light industrial area. By incorporating bioretention into the media we've created a gateway into this neighborhood. We were able to incorporate art as well as stormwater management that manages both sides of the roadway here and really reduce the need for any other underground stormwater infrastructure. And here's another really cool example. And again, this is kind of where it kind of all comes together. This was a community reinvestment strategy in Renton, Washington, where we had an underserved neighborhood that for years had been kind of blighted and had poor, public housing areas. So there's a partnership that developed between the city parks, King County Library System, and the Renton Housing Authority to develop a master plan that connected many of these community assets for schools, a community center, a senior home, and envisioned this idea working with the community of having green connections that connected all of these assets together to a new community park that was developed with regional stormwater inside of it. What it yielded was new, calmer traffic streets that also have curb bulbs to manage the stormwater, as well as this great new park that is for the neighborhood that expresses a little bit of the stormwater in front of the Highlands Library to kind of create a kind of a pollinator and ecosystem in front of those large, beautiful windows there, but also portions of the stormwater facility underneath lawn and playground areas so that the park can also be used for other community uses. Another example, this is from Washington, D.C. If you know Washington, D.C., you know that has a very radial street network. And so what it does is leaves a lot of rectangular or triangular spaces that are underutilized. In this case, Jacobs has worked with DC to actually create a number of different pocket parks in these areas to manage stormwater and create, again, community spaces that really soften up that edge between the traffic landscape and the communities. Here's another picture of that again. with smart landscape architecture design, you can actually make these very engaging spaces that both do stormwater as well as other functions. Another concept here, this is from Miami Beach, but this is blue-green infrastructure idea at the end of the street. So reclaiming that as being a bioretention and open wetland area at the end of a street area that's not utilized. Really what I want to leave you with is that, the premise here is really having a toolbox approach. You can have a lot of different green infrastructure techniques at your hands that really fit the feasibility, land use and site, and community. And where the intersection of all those are, that's where you have really good practices that can achieve this healthy streets vision. Another key to success on all these projects is collaboration is absolutely key. Again, usually the stormwater or the flood management group does not own the right of way. And so it takes a lot of collaboration with the community first and foremost, but also with the owners of the street, which is usually the Department of Transportation. And you need to understand undergoing these projects, the pros and cons of the joint projects. You're trying to do more with these spaces. So on a case-by-case example, it may not show as being cost savings, but when you join projects together for greater benefits, you're increasing the value of the project overall. And therefore, what's really key is also understanding where you can join together funding sources. I hand back to you, Elise.
Thanks, Dustin. And so Dustin was talking about his toolbox, and we get into urban flooding, the toolbox just gets even larger, right? And think about what you could do perhaps with even more right-of-way if you combined it with the urban flooding consent decree, water quality type toolbox in an urban area. I mean, if you've got a tunnel that's taking some of the water, combine that with other things or storage. How can you combine it with your CSO solutions, but also other things to go that extra step further to have layers of mitigation? And I think the healthy streets are a part of that. Flood proofing or structural elevation. How do we look at factor of safety for that planning ahead to keep the future safe? But also non-structural, looking at how's our emergency egress whenever we get into these healthy streets. Policy modifications again. I mean, do your local policies even allow road diets or things that we tend to call that way? Risk education data, make sure people understand what you're putting into place. And integration with your Clean Water Act obligations. How can we be creative and combine things? And community education is really at the core of that. So what makes a resilient community? Your healthy infrastructure, talking back to what I was talking about CSOs, it's blue, gray, and green. It's multicolored. You want to integrate everything to the extent that it makes sense, right? And what you can do within the constraints, especially if you're in an urban corridor, you're going to have constraints. And you got to look at it as a system and how it all works together. You got to recognize that your flooding problems, your water quality problems, they're not going to go away. There's climate change. It's probably only going to get worse. So the first step really is acknowledging that there's a problem, understanding your risk, and deciding what you're going to do about it. So resilient communities do a lot of things. And I don't know if there's any communities that do all of these, but they understand their risk, they understand the history and the cause of the problem. That's always a light bulb for communities, I think, once that realization is understood. They've chosen to anticipate and to adapt to future change. That choosing is very important. And also capable of tolerating and rebounding from events. Resilience, they've adapted at a community and at an individual level, not just the regional or city scale level. They value an integrated water cycle solution, and that includes their Clean Water Act obligations. They shape their policy for all the socioeconomic stakeholders and keep that mindful at the forefront. They engage with the community, partner with stakeholders, nonprofits, agencies, neighborhoods. Who are the agencies that help fund house repairs after floods? Because they probably have a stake in this too, but do we talk to them? Partner with those low-income financial programs and institutions. They've got more to contribute than you might think. And they financially invest in those mitigation strategies. Increasing flood insurance policy coverage too. Once you get that increased awareness, maybe that will come as well for what's the residual. So be resilient. All right. I think it's back to Dustin now.
Yep, and just to wrap up, we're going to leave you with this quote because it brings us all the way back to the initial premise here, this is from Janine Benyus, who's one of the founders of the Biomimicry Institute, but I love this quote. When the city and forest are functionally indistinguishable, that's when we'll really be at home in this climate. And so that's really what we're trying to do with this healthy streets concept, is inspire to be able to handle everything for the ecosystem as well as the humans. So with that, we're very excited to receive your questions. Thank you.
Thank you all for your great presentation. A reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat. We have 2 questions so far. The first one is, was the City of Renton project outside of the critical aquifer recharge area?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. It actually, for those familiar with the region, it's in the Highlands area of Renton, so it is outside of that critical aquifer recharge area, but it is regulated or permitted as an underground injection control facility because it does receive piped stormwater to the infiltration portion of that facility, which really was just more of a paperwork exercise. We did need to provide pre-treatment through the bioretention prior to discharging to that, but it was regulated as that, but we would not have been able to do that project as infiltration in the critical aquifer recharge area.
That makes sense. And then the second question is, with advanced planning, do you think that some of these solutions could be built as mitigation in urban settings post-disaster?
So that's a really great question. I could talk about that for a while. I think what you might be getting at is, and if I'm on the wrong tangent, just put it in the chat. I can see you, but we might be talking about 406 PA mitigation type funding, but there's also other things you can do with funding on things like this. So if you're looking at 406, that's just such an interesting question. I haven't really ever thought about that before, integrating green infrastructure into those kinds of projects. You know, with BRIC having such a big focus on green infrastructure, there might be openness to considering that on the part of PA. But, you know, because the whole principle of that is rebuilding it safely, better than it was before, more resilient than it was before. So, you know, you would have to work with FEMA on that, but it might be possible. The other thing on these kind of things, whenever you're looking at flood mitigation and integrating water quality mitigation, is that, like, let's say you were putting in a retention basin. There's EPA 319 funding or other funding. Once you get into the green type stuff, you can play the funding sources off of one another. That project I flashed up pretty quickly. We've got a couple of big detention retention facilities, and actually the city was able to get 319 funding to make them multifunctional. So we've actually got a permanent wetland in the bottom of one of those ponds, which is kind of cool. And you just do some benching and make it also work for the flooding. So I think part of that is absolutely, but you're right, you got to plan ahead and get creative.
All right, perfect. I think, we just got one more. Yes, they said yes, PA and redesign of storm channels and culvert crossings. So,
okay, great. Yeah, I think, yeah, you just got to be mindful of how you do it. And just upfront, let whoever you're working with from PA know that, is this possible? And just think about it now and then ask them after the disaster happens. Maybe you'll be resilient. You know, the idea is that we don't need PA funding anymore. So hopefully that's compatible.
That would be great, but that might be a while away.
Yeah, it is. It's sad. Yeah, sad, yes. But true.
All right. Well, I think that was all the questions we had. So thank you all very much. Our next presenter is Chris Jansen with Tetra Tech. He's going to present flood management and ancillary benefit to site development and public works projects. Mr. Jansen is a civil engineer whose work primarily consists of stormwater related projects in Southern California. Mr. Jansen has both design and construction support experience in such areas as storm drain and pump station design, hydraulic and hydrologic modeling, and stormwater capture and use projects. Mr. Jansen holds a civil engineering degree from both UCLA and Stanford with an emphasis in water resources engineering, environmental fluids, and hydrology. Welcome, Mr. Jansen, and looking forward to your presentation.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending my presentation. I hope that the conference is going well for all of you so far. My name is Chris Jansen, and I'm a professional civil engineer with Tetra Tech, and I'm currently based out of the Irvine, California office, which is in Southern California, just south of Los Angeles County, for those who aren't familiar with the area. I primarily focus on stormwater projects that typically involve some sort of stormwater capture components in order to reduce pollution downstream and to increase local water supply. because as most of you probably know, we don't get a whole lot of rainfall in Southern California. And so projects like this are vital to ensuring a sustainable future for Southern California. So today I'm going to discuss several things. Mainly, I'm going to focus on how these same types of projects I was just mentioning can also provide ancillary flood management benefits. And I'm going to discuss this by going over 3 case studies at 3 different project scales. And so I'm going to start at the site development level by discussing the Vista Canyon Regional Transit Center project. I'll then discuss a more local municipal project by discussing the Merced Avenue Greenway project. And then I'll conclude by discussing a regional project case study, which is the Carruthers Park Urban Stormwater and Urban Runoff Capture Project. And so as mentioned in the last slide, there are different scales of projects that can provide these ancillary flood management benefits. And so this is just showing a picture of each type. And in the top right, you see a site development project. It's a parking lot that has some permeable pavements and as well as some green infrastructure there to reduce imperviousness, to capture some of the runoff, and to overall reduce the amount of stormwater runoff going to the storm drain system. Then at the bottom right, you have more local municipal projects. And at least in Southern California, there's a big push for green streets, and even more, there's a push for complete streets projects, which have several different aspects to them, one of which is typically installing a bunch of green infrastructure along the street corridor to reduce stormwater runoff and reduce stormwater pollution. And then at the bottom left side of the screen, there's an example of a regional stormwater capture project where they're installing some precast underground reservoir. And these projects are typically, it's after the stormwater has already reached the storm drain system, and the projects typically involve removing the water from the storm drain or flood control channels, and then storing them in an underground reservoir and using that water for some beneficial use, whether that be infiltration, capture and use, using it on site for spray irrigation, or we've even had projects where we send the water to the wastewater treatment plant to be treated and then reused as recycled water. So getting into the first case study, which is the Vista Canyon Regional Transit Center. And as previously mentioned, this is a site development project. So we're starting at the smaller scale and we'll work our way up. So the objectives of this project, the primary objective is to provide a safe and efficient bus transfer station in the city of Santa Clarita, California, and to encourage alternate modes of transportation. And Santa Clarita, that's just north of Los Angeles. If any of you have been to Six Flags Magic Mountain, that's where that's located. And some secondary objectives to this project include increasing the green space at the project site, which also provides some aesthetic benefits, and also to improve the stormwater quality and reduce flooding downstream by implementing low impact development techniques. So this slide shows the site plan. And the main things I wanted to point out here are on the north and south side of the project. There's some permeable pavements as well as planters between all of these different canopies where passengers will be waiting in the shade. And the purpose of those LIDs is to reduce imperviousness, which ultimately will reduce the amount of runoff that will be draining to the storm drain system. And then at the center of the project, there's this big oval shape you can see there. That's the bioretention basin. And so the runoff that is generated from the project will drain first to that bioretention basin to be treated before it continues on to the storm drain system. So with these site development projects, the local regulations have us look at what's called hydromodification, which is the alteration of hydrologic characteristics of coastal and non-coastal waters. So they have us look at the changes of land use and imperviousness at the site, and how that affects the peak flow rates, the total volumes, the peak velocities, and the time of concentrations for various storm events. And the big requirement for us is to make sure that the proposed flow rates for the 2-year storm is the same or less than the existing conditions. And as you can see in the table to the right, for the 2-year storm, there was actually an increase of 218% increase in the peak flow rate for the 2-year storm due to the increase in imperviousness. In addition to hydromodification, this project ties into a Los Angeles County flood control district storm drain. And so we had to obtain a permit from them to discharge. And they require for the 50-year storm a maximum discharge of 2.5 CFS per acre, which for this project of 1.23 acres resulted in 3.08 CFS for the 50-year storm. And again, in the table to the right, you can see we were generating 4 CFS for the 50-year storm, which is an increase from existing conditions of over 50%, and it's also above what flood control would allow us to discharge. And so the way that we deal with these issues is with this big bioretention basin, which is in the center of the project that I showed previously. And by incorporating this basin, it takes time for the water to drain into the basin and fill up the basin up to this 18-inch ponding depth. And it takes time for the water to filter through the soil, filter through the gravel, and into this underdrain. And so that time delay spreads out the hydrograph or attenuates the peak flow rates so that we can reduce it down to acceptable levels. And so this slide shows on the left, it's an outlet structure. And so basically when the water fills, for the larger storm events, when the water fills up that 18 inches of ponding, it then starts to weir over into this outlet structure through a graded inlet, and then continue out down that 8-inch HDPE outlet pipe. And so the table to the right is showing the proposed flow rates that's leaving the basin through this outlet structure. And as you can see, once we route the flows through that basin, we're actually seeing a 68% decrease in the peak flow rate for the 2-year storm, which by far satisfies the hydromodification requirements. And then we're even seeing a 5% decrease in peak flow rate for the 50-year storm. And we're much less than that 3.08 CFS that was required by flood control district. Okay, so next I'm going to discuss another case study. This is the Merced Avenue Greenway project. And this is a local project case study that's at the municipal level within the public right-of-way. And the project benefits include, number one, improving pedestrian and bike mobility, connectivity, and safety. So the connectivity, the project is connecting the corridor to a nearby recreation area. And these are some of the aspects of that complete streets projects that I discussed earlier. And then the second aspect that we're most interested in is the green infrastructure. And so by installing green infrastructure, that leads to several benefits. It enhances the water quality in the watershed. It combats extreme heats and reduces the urban heat island effect. And that's what's shown in this figure here to the right. And for those not familiar, the urban heat island effect is basically this phenomena where the more concrete, hard surfaces, the more tall buildings that you install in an area, the more that heat gets trapped in that area. And that increases the temperature compared to surrounding suburban areas and rural areas. And so by adding greenery, where we are reducing that through evaporative cooling, through transpiration, as well as by providing shade and allowing the vegetation to to use that heat and use that energy from the sun for photosynthesis, as opposed to storing it in concrete. In addition, this green infrastructure provides flood protection benefits by removing stormwater from the streets and infiltrating it into the ground. And this project, as you'll see, incorporates several different types of green infrastructure, and it really serves as a scalable project. So for other projects in the future of varying size and scope, they can use this project as an example and scale it as needed to meet their project needs. So this project, the corridor is 1.1 miles long. The project's located in the city of South El Monte, which is in East Los Angeles County. And the project is divided into two areas, a north and a south area. So the top two pictures and then the bottom left picture, those represent the north area, which is primarily industrial land use. And then the three pictures at the bottom right represent the southern end of the project site, which is primarily residential land use. And so getting into the green infrastructure components, this picture here shows a typical cross-section along the corridor. And as you can see, we're incorporating several different types of green infrastructure. So at the bottom, you can see along the sidewalk, the center of the sidewalk, there's a bunch of planters. And the purpose of that is, it's plentiful, but for stormwater, it's to reduce the amount of stormwater runoff being generated along the corridor. There's bioretention areas on both sides of the streets, which intercepts flows from the street, routes it through vegetation, which helps to reduce pollutants, and then filters it through some soil media, and ultimately infiltrates into the ground. There's also permeable pavers along the gutter in the northern portion of the corridor to infiltrate additional stormwater. And then there's these high infiltration biofiltration areas in that magenta color there. And those are very similar to the bioretention areas, except that they can pass water through much, much quicker. And the purpose of these is basically if any water bypasses the upstream bioretention areas and permeable pavements, they'll still be able to enter these biofiltration areas so that they're at least treated before being discharged to the local storm drain. So this image and detail is showing an example of a permeable gutter. It's pretty straightforward, but basically the water runs off of the street into the gutter and then just soaks down into the gravel below. There's also infiltration chambers that we're using below to facilitate additional stormwater storage as it slowly seeps into the ground beneath it. The bioretention areas, if any, in areas where there are not permeable pavements, or during larger storms where the permeable pavement isn't enough to capture that stormwater, it'll continue down the curb and gutter, and then it'll enter these bioretention areas through openings in the curb. It'll pond up to 6 inches, and then it'll start to filter down through the soil media and into these infiltration chambers below, which again serve to increase the storage capacity of the system as water starts to infiltrate. And then finally, we have these high infiltration media biofiltration areas, which is almost identical to the bioretention, except that the soil media will send the water through very quickly. It's high infiltration media, and these you can't tell from the detail, but these areas are also connected to the storm drain system. So it's really just there to kind of detain the water, slow the runoff down, as we saw in Vista Canyon Park, to attenuate that peak flow rate, as well as to provide some filtration and water quality benefits so that we can reduce pollution in the downstream receiving bodies. And finally, get to the regional project case study, which is the Crothers Park Stormwater and Urban Runoff Capture Project. So this project is located in the city of Bellflower, which is in southern Los Angeles County, not far from the city of Long Beach. And the goals of the project, the primary goal is to prevent pollutants from discharging into the downstream receiving waters, which for this project is the San Gabriel River and the Los Cerritos Channel. In addition, by capturing the water and infiltrating the water, as well as storing the water for on-site irrigation, we're increasing the local water supply and decreasing flooding by removing water from those storm drain systems. And lastly, this multi-benefit project provides community benefits as well. In addition to just restoring the excavated areas to existing conditions, the project includes the addition of 44 new trees. It replaces a wading pool with a more interactive splash pad for the kids to enjoy. And it replaces the playgrounds with brand new playgrounds, as well as some additional park amenities, such as barbecue grills and a new parking lot. And so the project highlights, again, I'll focus on the stormwater highlights here. The project is capturing water from a drainage area of over 3,000 acres. And it's capturing water from 2 separate watersheds. So as you can see on the right, the total watershed there. And the area in blue is falls within the lower San Gabriel River watershed. And that drains about just under 3,000 acres. And then the green area is part of the Los Cerritos Channel watershed. And that drains 261 acres that's tributary to the park. 40% of this total tributary area lands in the city of Bellflower, which is where Crothers Park is located. And then the other 60% is within the city of Downey. And so the water that we're collecting from the Los Cerritos Channel watershed, that's coming from a 72-inch reinforced concrete pipe. And we're diverting that at 20 cubic feet per second, or CFS. And then from the lower San Gabriel River watershed, we are diverting up to 50 CFS through a graded drop inlet diversion, along with an inflatable rubber dam. And once the water is diverted, it goes down into a 9 acre-foot storage facility, where 1 acre-foot is dedicated to irrigation storage, which will offset 100% of the park's irrigation demand. And the other 8 acre-feet is an infiltration gallery to replenish the groundwater aquifer. And so this slide shows the more specific design components, and you can get a better visual of what the project looks like. And so at the top right corner, you see the flood control channel. That's where we're diverting water from the lower San Gabriel River watershed. In fact, you can see the San Gabriel River just to the right of that. This channel actually discharges there just a few hundred feet downstream of our diversion. And then on the bottom left side of the screen is the 72-inch RCP diversion, where we divert up to 20 CFS at a time. And both diversion lines route the water first through a pre-treatment device. For this project, it's the Storm Trap Site Saver. And the purpose of the pre-treatment is to concentrate maintenance at one location, also to remove any big trash and debris that make it into the storm drain pipe, and to promote sedimentation, as well as to remove any oils that might be there in the water through an oil absorption boom. After the pre-treatment device, the water continues down into the storage reservoir. So the water from the 20 CFS diversion, that goes directly into an infiltration gallery. But the water from the 50 CFS diversion, first that goes into that 1 acre-foot storage area that's there. It's a watertight containment area to store water for irrigation on site. Once that 1 acre-foot storage area fills up, the water then wears over into the infiltration area. This project also involves a harvest and use component. So at the bottom right, there's a picture of some media filters. And so basically at nights when it's time to irrigate, there's a pump station and the pumps will be triggered to turn on, and it'll send water down to these harvesting units where it's cleaned through screen filters, media filters, and UV disinfection before continuing to irrigate the park. And the last component on this slide that you can see is there's a call out for a future recycled water connection. And that is in case the local district wants this water in the future for recycled water as they expand their network of recycled water pipelines. This project can actually provide that because in addition to the irrigation event, there's actually more water, especially during the storm season, that's it's not being utilized, it's just being infiltrated. So that's something for a proposed future project that's would be exciting to see, and one of the first of its kind to do something like that. And so in summary, I've discussed today how projects of varying scope and scale that don't necessarily focus on flood management as the primary goal can still provide flood management benefits. And I talked about 3 different case studies, the first being Vista Canyon Transit Center, which is a site development project of just 1.23 acres. And the project provides several different LID features that provide a 68% reduction in the peak flow rate for the 2-year storm and a 5% reduction in the peak flow rate for the 50-year storm. I then discussed the Merced Avenue Greenway project, which is a local municipal project that captures water from a 78-acre drainage area. And the project can remove up to 2.91 acre feet of stormwater runoff from the street gutters through green infrastructure. Finally, I discussed the Carruthers Park Stormwater and Urban Runoff Capture Project. This is a regional project with a drainage area of 3,256 acres. And the project provides 2 storm drain diversions of 50 CFS and 20 CFS from 2 separate watersheds. And the project removes up to 9 acre feet of stormwater from these storm drain systems to help alleviate potential flooding issues downstream. With that, I just want to say thank you again for your time and for listening to my presentation today. And I'll go ahead and take questions at this time.
Great. Thank you, Chris, for that presentation. We have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, for the barbecue grills in the project you mentioned, did they use conventional pavement?
The barbecue grills? Yeah, it was scattered throughout the grassy area, actually. So they were on a little concrete pad, but it was just standard pavement.
Okay. And then were any of the presented BMPs for abstraction, infiltration, reuse directed by local ordinances, or did they do them voluntarily?
I guess depends on which project specifically, but I guess none of them were, we kind of had freedom to choose, which types of BMPs seem to work out best. We, like for Carruthers Park project, we did a preliminary design report. So we kind of did a bunch of modeling and explored like different types of BMP options to see what would work out best. And in the end, we came up with the underground infiltration and storage galleries. Merced Avenue was a fairly complicated project. It had a ton of different BMP features. The main thing that the city wanted was to keep everything kind of shallow and close to the surface. So that was a challenge in order to try and capture the full 85th percentile storm volume by doing just like surface BMPs. And then the Vista Canyon, there wasn't a whole lot of room on the site to incorporate too many BMPs. It's kind of a smaller site, so there wasn't a whole lot of options. We looked at infiltration as a first option. That's typically preferred by the municipalities, and but the infiltration rates were too low it didn't meet the feasibility requirements. So usually when that happens, then we go the route of a biofiltration basin.
Okay. So were the projects required because they were doing a development and they had to meet a post-construction water quality requirement, or was it the city decided to do a project?
Yeah, so Vista Canyon, it was more, that was a requirement to make sure that they captured the 85th percentile storm volume. For Merced Avenue, that one, the specific goal of the project was greening. It was kind of complete streets project, but one of the goals from the city was to add greenery and capture the stormwater. And then for Carruthers Park, that was kind of dictated by I guess same with Merced, they're both kind of dictated by the MS4 permit, the municipal separate sewer system permit requirements. And so for LA County and well, really state of California, they're pushing to do a lot of these regional projects as sort of another way to try and remove a lot of the pollutants from the local waterways. So instead of, like Merced Avenue and Vista Canyon are more sort of source control, and then Carruthers Park is more a downstream water quality control type of project.
Okay. Then the next question is, at what depth are the infiltration chambers usually installed? Did you have any issues in California with high groundwater that would prevent the chambers from being installed?
Yeah, I think that they're all about 4 feet below ground is roughly where the bottom of the infiltration were for Merced Avenue, and for Carruthers Park, it's more like 15 to 20 feet. And for Carruthers Park, we just had to maintain 10 feet above the historic groundwater level, and we looked at historic groundwater levels and also the last 50 years of data for nearby groundwater wells, and based on both of those, we were just making sure we were 10 feet above that. And for Merced Avenue, there was actually a portion of the project where we were too close to the groundwater, and so we had to incorporate under drains into the BMPs and then connect that with the storm drain system. So there's a small portion toward I can't remember if it's the north or the south end of the project, but there's a small portion where we're not able to retain it on site. We just treat the water and then send it back to the storm drain.
And then there was a question, how were the GI projects funded? Okay.
So the big Carruthers Park project, that was through the California Department of Transportation. They pretty much paid for it, because then when they're paying for the funding, I think that they're getting credit for a portion of the drainage that's coming off of the highways and the roadways. And then for Merced Avenue, it was a bunch of different groups actually. It was the Water Foundation, Coastal Conservancy, Disney Foundation, and then there's also some state propositions. And then actually both of those projects have some funding as well from a new tax measure in LA County called Measure W, or the Safe Clean Water Program, which is huge. I think it's $300 million per year from people, private property are paying per square foot of impervious area on their property. And they're using that to fund a ton of projects now. But for Carruthers Park, that's going to be used for the O&M portion moving forward after construction. And then Merced Avenue, they're actually waiting to get approval for that funding before they continue and start construction.
All right. That's great that they have an O&M source of funding, because that's always a challenge, I know, with these projects.
Yeah, that was a big part, I think, of the Measure W, definitely. So you can apply for the full life cycle funding, or just design, or just O&M, or just construction. So yeah, it's nice to have that flexibility.
Yeah, that's great. I believe that's all the questions. If I missed yours, I'm sorry. But thank you very much for being here today. Our next person.
Yeah, thank you.
Our next presenter is Kristiane Huber with the Pew Charitable Trust. Ms. Huber is a principal associate on the state policy and campaigns portfolio of Pew's Flood Prepared Communities Initiative. Her work promotes state-level planning that prioritizes and incentivizes nature-based solutions to flooding and discourages development in areas with flood risk, focusing on North Carolina. Previously, Huber was a fellow at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, leading the Resilience Program. She holds a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and government from Connecticut College and a Master of Science in Natural Resources and Environment from the University of Michigan in the School for Environment and Sustainability. So her presentation is Action Plan for Advancing Nature-Based Stormwater Strategies in North Carolina. So welcome.
Hello, my name is Kristiane Huber, and I work with the Pew Charitable Trust's Flood Prepared Communities team. And today I'll be presenting on the Action Plan for Advancing Nature-Based Stormwater Strategies in North Carolina. So first, some background on the Flood Prepared Communities Initiative and on Pew Charitable Trusts. Pew works across issue areas from health to governance to environment, looking for solutions to environmental and societal challenges. Our initiative is within Pew's environmental portfolio, and the Flood Prepared Communities team works both at the federal and on the state level. Our goal is to reduce the impact of weather-related catastrophes such as floods and hurricanes on the U.S. taxpayer and environment by better preparing communities through federal and state policy reform in 4 areas: federal flood insurance, infrastructure, pre-disaster mitigation, and nature-based solutions to flood control. On the state level, we work to support comprehensive state-level planning with the goal of reducing unsustainable development in high-risk areas, defining and prioritizing nature-based stormwater solutions, and restoring and enhancing the natural function of the floodplain. Currently, we're working across about 10 states or so, pursuing state-level action to reduce flood risk, and that is through this comprehensive planning, which incorporates interagency coordination, comprehensively assesses flood risk on the watershed scale, and looks to nature-based solutions to mitigate risk. We are working specifically in North Carolina to address stormwater challenges. The North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan really highlights that these challenges are going to only grow in the coming years, with heavy precipitation from more intense and frequent storms causing significant damage to public and private structures. So beyond hurricanes and tropical storms, this includes a greater number of intense rainstorms through much of the year and across much of North Carolina's geography. This is not just coastal flooding. Rapid development has played a role in increased stormwater issues as well. We have this statistic in our report. Since 2010, the state's population growth outperformed the nation, expanding by 8.9% compared to the nation's 5.8%. This population growth, combined with millions of tourists that are attracted each year to spend time in beautiful North Carolina, result in more development. As we know, urban and suburban development eliminates natural vegetation while covering surfaces with pavement, roofs, and other impervious surfaces. This creates stormwater runoff from the impervious surfaces, sometimes causing flooding and carrying contaminants downhill into streams, rivers, and coastal waters, or through stormwater systems overwhelming their capacity. So why nature-based solutions? We were really focused on nature-based solutions because North Carolina has determined that they are a crucial climate resilience strategy. And the resilience plan asserts that the time to implement nature-based solutions is now, due to the time required to plan, implement, and grow these solutions. So how are we defining nature-based stormwater strategies? They can employ a variety of materials, design principles, or rely on preserving and restoring natural or working lands to provide these services. This image shows use of bioretention or a rain garden, disconnected impervious surfaces, having stormwater run off the roof into a rain barrel, and permeable pavement. Much larger scale solutions can also be used, like pervious pavement on roads and highways, large bioretention basins, large green roofs on factories or other large facilities, and landscape scale changes. So given the benefits of nature-based solutions and their broad opportunity, Pew Charitable Trusts joined with the North Carolina Coastal Federation to answer the question, how can North Carolina more broadly apply nature-based solutions to address stormwater-related flooding and water quality challenges? To answer this question, we launched a research initiative last year in March 2020. We established the work groups, which I will explain more in the next slide, groups of stakeholders to really advise, as you see in the meetings, what are the barriers to nature-based stormwater strategies, brainstorming solutions and opportunities, refining those recommendations, and identifying the priority actions. This was across 4 meetings that happened between March and November 2020. Then the team at North Carolina Coastal Federation wrote the action plan with work group review and peer review through the winter. And that all led to us releasing the action plan in March of 2021. So the 4 work groups are really the backbone of this research. They are new development, which of course looked at opportunities for nature-based stormwater strategies in any new construction. In retrofits, we're really looking at how changes and updates to existing developments can reduce or disconnect impervious surfaces and slow stormwater runoff. We also had a work group focusing on roadways, and that was looking at large highways as well as more local streets. And then we also had a working group on working lands, which considered agriculture and forestry as well as just open space and space held by other institutions like the military or universities. Each of these work groups had stakeholders from a lot of different backgrounds. Several of those are listed here. They brought perspectives from state government, from local government, researchers and practitioners, engineers and environmentalists. And that resulted in really practical recommendations that draw a lot on interdisciplinary approaches from the people that were involved. So through all of those people meeting, for all of those months, we developed the action plan for nature-based stormwater strategies, which was released in March 2021 with a press conference and some praise from agency staff, such as this quote from Chief Deputy Secretary John Nicholson of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. This action plan has many findings. I will overview just a select few of them today. There are key impediments, cross-cutting recommendations, which are really the overarching themes of the action plan, work group specific recommendations, which are a little more in the nitty-gritty from those specific work groups, really thinking about those very specific 4 land uses, and next steps, which identify some priority first actions that need to happen for the rest of this action plan to really be successful. So first, I wanted to overview the impediments that the work groups reported out. First, there is lack of awareness and education, knowledge gaps, and unfamiliarity with nature-based stormwater strategies among a wide diversity of important stakeholders impedes their use. And this includes landowners, developers, homeowners, regulators, policymakers, and many others. In flexible planning, regulations, and policy, many state and local land use plans, regulations, and policies were developed before the concept of nature-based solutions existed. and are therefore not prepared to facilitate their use. Additionally, some existing planning practices and policies actually really limit the use of nature-based stormwater strategies. Design challenges. Design planning frequently does not incorporate stormwater management questions early enough in the process to really start building in nature-based stormwater strategy consideration. And those approaches just are often not considered at all. High costs and gaps in funding. Many stakeholders perceive that the cost of nature-based solutions is higher than conventional stormwater management measures. And sometimes the opposite is true, especially when you're considering the life cycle cost. There is limited funding to operate and maintain all stormwater management systems, including those that are nature-based solutions. The next impediment is inadequate operation and maintenance. Consistent guidance for operation and maintenance of all stormwater systems, including nature-based ones, is lacking. And lastly, lack of monitoring and evaluation. There is no routine system in place to monitor and evaluate nature-based stormwater strategies. And monitoring some of the smaller devices and scale solutions, and also geographically dispersed systems would be really challenging given the ways of monitoring and evaluating other stormwater solutions. So moving into our cross-cutting recommendations, the number one recommendation that all of the work groups shared is that state and local governments need to lead by example. They need to consistently and systematically encourage the use of nature-based stormwater strategies when undertaking any new government construction projects, making infrastructure, investing in housing, and really any policy change. Next, there is a need to increase education, outreach, and professional training for nature-based stormwater and watershed management strategies. State and local leadership, as well as associated professional and educational organizations, need to promote education and training of nature-based stormwater strategies. This is across a lot of different pathways. This is through existing platforms. This is through degree programs. This is through continuing education. And it needs to be targeted at a wide array at stakeholders and practitioners. There's a lot of opportunity for state leadership to partner with nonprofits and universities to promote also workforce development, creating training for more entry-level jobs, making sure that they also understand nature-based stormwater strategies. Our third recommendation is to create a nature-based stormwater steering committee to ensure continued stakeholder engagement and leadership in support of long-term meaningful progress. This is really more of a process recommendation. This is really a next step. And this is looking for a core group of community leaders, business owners, experts, and other diverse stakeholders similar to what we had involved in the work groups, continuing to provide leadership and advice on how to implement some of these plans. The final recommendation is to establish effective watershed management that focuses on protecting, restoring, or mimicking natural water systems to reduce flooding and improve water quality. The 4 work groups' central recommendations calls for this effective watershed management plan. It is vital to develop watershed management plans in order to inform the use of nature-based stormwater strategies and make sure that they are cost-effective and strategic. The work groups found that focusing on both flood reduction and water quality enhancements in devising this program would be a really efficient and novel way to address both water quality and flood issues. And it could really position North Carolina to be a national leader in water resource management by considering those 2 objectives in the same time. Now our recommendations by work group. First, new development. So these are more kind of thematic recommendations in the report, and underneath each of them, there are several very specific actions, which I will not be running through today. So a new development, the first is to promote the use of nature-based stormwater strategies and low-impact development decision-making tools already approved by either the state or local government. This ranges from expediting permit applications to reduce runoff, ensure there are technical specialists and relevant agencies, and a number of other actions. To exemplify support in state leadership, all state-funded construction projects should use nature-based stormwater strategies when technically and economically feasible. This commitment would likely be made by the governor, though it could be legislative. And it actually mirrors some federal policy on seeking to maintain pre-development hydrology on any land where there is a federal project. Our third recommendation is that local governments strive to do the same, to use nature-based solutions in whatever projects they can, and really look to the state on leading that. The state can support local governments in doing this by providing funding, but also by creating resources like model policy incentives and ordinances for communities to adopt. The next work group recommendations are in the retrofit section. The first is to generally promote nature-based stormwater strategies as cost-effective and a preferred way to retrofit stormwater systems. This really is looking to use nature-based stormwater strategies to bring failing stormwater systems into regulatory compliance. This could be accomplished through a number of specific actions, but one specific one is to add a new chapter to the DEQ Stormwater Design Manual to provide guidance on the appropriate uses of nature-based strategies in addressing compliance issues. The second recommendation is to expand the use of nature-based stormwater strategies by state and local agencies when retrofitting government-owned existing properties, especially capital improvements that are already happening. And this is really getting at consider nature-based approaches first when upgrading, updating, or redeveloping existing facilities. The third recommendation is to allocate state resources and secure significant additional financial resources for retrofit projects that use nature-based stormwater strategies. And this is about finding the money to do some of this, and especially more long-term continued application of nature-based solutions in retrofits. Our third work group recommendations are from roadways. The first is to develop educational and technical resources to improve the understanding of transportation professionals on the use of nature-based stormwater solutions. This could be in the form of a guidance manual for transportation planners, additional technical guidance. The second recommendation is to complete a technical review of existing regulations and guidance that serve as disincentives or impediments to the use of nature-based stormwater strategies along roadways. So based on this review, DOT working group would recommend changes to existing laws, rules, and ordinances. The third recommendation is to increase and prioritize the use of nature-based stormwater strategies across state, local, and private agencies. So that is really about the state also leading and using these solutions in road projects, and also in empowering more local transportation departments to understand and use nature-based approaches whenever possible. Fourth, engage transportation agencies as partners in community-wide efforts that seek to maximize the use of nature-based stormwater strategies. This is acknowledging that transportation agencies are some of the largest landholders in the state, and there are lots of opportunities to incorporate stormwater strategies in different planning initiatives across watershed management planning, and they're a key partner in all of this. Our fourth working group recommendations are working lands. So the first recommendation really is acknowledging that working lands already serve nature-based stormwater functions and significantly reduce flooding and improve water quality. And really, the key is maintaining that land use wherever possible. And there are also opportunities to, of course, to manage land better and differently in order to capture more floodwater and improve water quality more downstream. The second recommendation is to pursue strategic partnerships and regional planning to protect, restore, or replicate natural hydrology on working lands that provide mutual benefits to landowners in the state. And that is really acknowledging that some of the larger landholders, like transportation departments, but also more along the lines of federal agencies, including Department of Defense, and some other unlikely partners, might be holding lands that have really critical flood resilience benefits, and that functionality should be acknowledged, and those lands should be maintained to really maximize those benefits. So there are many priority actions listed in the report. I will not go through all of them. I'm going to highlight a couple that I've already talked about a bit in our presentation. The first is developing this comprehensive watershed management framework. This really is an underlying step to implementing the rest of this action plan. And there has actually been some legislation in North Carolina that could incorporate this, and there has been some interest at the state level in doing a comprehensive watershed management plan. On our next page, of all of these priority actions, I want to highlight advancing state and local policies promoting nature-based stormwater strategies. Coming out of this process, especially the state agency representatives that were involved, there's already been some interest in the state really leading on this and really leading that implementation of nature-based solutions as recommended in the resilience plan. We're also seeing some leadership from communities that want to change stormwater ordinances and really improve the use of nature-based stormwater strategies across their communities and in some cases even beyond town lines. You'll see that much of the rest of these priority actions are focused on continuing research and continuing stakeholder engagement to inform some of the more specific processes at the state and with DOT. But Pew Charitable Trusts is most focused on these two highlighted priorities, and looking forward to continuing to work on them in the state. So the Action Plan for Nature-Based Stormwater Strategies is available at North Carolina Coastal Federation's website. I encourage you to check it out. There's lots of other very specific actions and steps that I didn't include in this in case it wasn't fitting for the entire audience. We do think that this is a transferable model to other places, to really bringing together stakeholders that can answer these questions of how to address these environmental challenges as well as these flood risk challenges at the same time, and really get the best of those different professional areas and make sure that your flood risk management efforts don't have adverse impacts to water quality and vice versa. So on that, I think that is my entire presentation. It was lovely to share this report, and my email is available below if anyone has questions or is interested in the report. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Let's see. We have gotten a couple of questions or some comments. The first one is kudos to the team for an action plan that is only 28 pages. I don't think I've ever seen a government publication with only 28 pages. So I agree. I think sometimes they're so overwhelming that you just don't have time to even look at them. So
We were very diligent about that, actually. And that was very intentional. So I'm glad it's an easy read for everyone. Well,
I think
easy in terms of length, maybe not in terms of content.
Right. Yes. And then someone asked where you could find the plan, and I saw that somebody put the link in the chat. So if you want to look for the plan, there's a link in the chat, and it was also in the presentation. I believe there was one other question. Okay. It says, I'm excited how the presentations exemplified how adopting nature-based strategies can be accomplished while enhancing, not reducing the community experience while achieving vital water quality, flood control, rate control, and volume control goals. So just another person who's excited that we have, I agree, I think it's great that we're looking for ways to treat water and also be able to do the things that we like to do. So
yeah, in our recruitment of members of the work groups, we really made a point of having a lot of input from people that work at the community level and are able to, as the comment says, think about the ways that nature-based solutions can really enrich and improve and make safer communities that are experiencing these issues.
There is another question that just came in. Can you define working lands?
Yeah, in our report, it is focused on agricultural and forest lands, but it also incorporates other land holders that it's mostly open space. So it could be universities that also have parklands or things that resemble open space. And also in North Carolina, the Department of Defense is a really large landholder and actually also holds a lot of open space. And so that was not a focus of that section, but it did keep coming up that was a really key partner and a really key land use and landholder to think about. So focused on agriculture and forestry, but for the purposes of North Carolina, kind of broadened to be more inclusive.
I think those are all the questions we have for now. So I'd just like to thank all of our presenters for the great presentations and thank the audience for sticking with us through the last session of the conference. So we look forward to seeing you all next year in Orlando. I think that's it. Thank you all very much.